Kendrick Lamar has dominated the music world since 2012, with in-depth lyricism, storytelling ability, and unique vocal charisma. With 5 albums under his belt, Kendrick has consistently proven himself to be one of the most creative musicians of our generation. Like many sophisticated artists, Kendrick is a perfectionist, and while his released work is top-notch, he has a lot of unreleased projects that are relatively unknown to even a lot of hardcore fans. With Kendrick being so dedicated to putting out top-notch records, he has worked on, recorded, and even finished albums to their entirety, only to never release them. From collab albums with fellow artists such as J. Cole and Baby Keem, to original versions of his classic records such as Good Kid, Mad City that would be entirely finished only to be scrapped and remade from the start, K-Dot's unreleased catalog is truly fascinating. And today, we detail what we know about Kendrick Lamar's unreleased albums, featuring the OG Good Kid, Mad City, a J. Cole collab album, a Kendrick rock record, and many more. Following the release of his 4th mixtape, C4, Kendrick would discuss his future plans for his music in a 2009 interview with Hood News. In the video, Kendrick says that his next mixtape is on the way, and according to the man himself, it was going to be called Before I Commit Suicide.
Oh man, it's K-Dot straight out of Compton, man. You know, I got shit pressing all on the motherfucker in there. I just got the C4 put out right now, you know what I mean? That's a mixtape. Got my next mixtape coming out, Before I Commit Suicide.
Unfortunately, we don't know much about this mixtape, what it would have sounded like, what songs had been on it, what the story would have been. Really, all we know is that, from Kendrick himself in 2009, it existed. With Kendrick's dedication to storytelling, I'd imagine that this would have been a fascinating listen, with the title being so drastic and dramatic, but obviously, the project would never see the light of day. Now, to put this into perspective timeline-wise, this was before Kendrick released Overly Dedicated, let alone before he released his first album, Section 80. However, at the end of that same interview, Kendrick quickly name drops Good Kid, Mad City, referring to it as a project that would be coming out soon.
You know what I mean? Got another one coming out called motherfucking Good Kid, Mad City, so I'm just pressing the streets.
This is because Kendrick, in 2009, was already working on the legendary album that would eventually be released in 2012. But that's not even the crazy part. According to people around Kendrick's camp, the first version of Good Kid, Mad City would be finished completely in 2009. This version would be completely different from the final copy of the album that would be released in 2012, but Kendrick would completely scrap it. With Kendrick name-dropping Good Kid, Mad City in that interview, we know that he was working on the record as early as 2009, likely even before that year. This section specifically is so fascinating because a lot of the time with unreleased albums, yeah, you got the beats and everything, but songs traditionally aren't finished. The artists aren't, fully finishing their verses yet, they're mumbling on tracks. But according to Mixed by Ali, the guy who has mixed Kendrick Lamar's albums for pretty much Kendrick's entire career, this 2009 version of Good Kid, Mad City was not only entirely finished, but also mixed, only for Kendrick to trash it.
How many songs do you think you made for that album that didn't get used? A lot. You were recording for a long ass time.
There's a whole Good Kid, Mad City album that we finished mixing everything that just is never gonna see the day.
Really?
Before Dre, before anybody, it was a whole Good Kid, Mad City.
Wow.
Which I have on my drive, and I, from time to time, I might listen to them records because it was just that great. Even hearing that first project, it was like, it's fucking over.
So on some hard drive out there, the original version of Good Kid, Mad City is just sitting there on file. Because Ali is one of the very few people who have actually heard this album, we obviously don't know which tracks are present on it. If any of the tracks originally on the 2009 version made it on the final copy of Good Kid, Mad City in 2012, I would be pretty surprised, because Dr. Dre's influence and involvement as the executive producer of the record is a very important element of the project. While we're not sure exactly why Kendrick decided to rework the album back then, it can be assumed to be a product of Kendrick just wanting to get his story, perfectly right. Kendrick would reveal in a 2017 interview that he and his crew would rework Good Kid, Mad City about 3 to 4 times before finally being confident in the album and releasing it. While it is fascinating to think what the album would have sounded like back then in 2009, I think Kendrick's process can be trusted, with the released version in 2012 being regarded as one of the greatest hip-hop albums of all time. Although we were just talking about 2012 with the final version of Good Kid, Mad City, we got to go back in time again to that year that the OG version was made, because we got some unfinished business. So following C4, Kendrick would release an EP that was self-titled, simply called Kendrick Lamar. It's an important moment in his discography, as it marked the transition from his work being released under his birth name, rather than the previously used stage name, K. Following the release of the EP, Kendrick understood that he had a lot of material that was still decent, people should definitely hear it, it's quality, yet they just didn't belong on the main project. So, the plan was to release all these unreleased tracks together in 2010, with the project set to be about 20 to 30 tracks long. Unlike the previous sections, we actually have some intel on what songs may have ended up on this long-ass mixtape. Scrap songs from the self-titled sessions include Come Up Freestyle, Wantin' Life, Waiting, Shut Your Mouth, and King of My City, featuring J-Rock. However, for whatever reason, Kendrick would not go through with releasing this long mixtape of unreleased material, and instead would shift his attention to working on his next mixtape, Overly Dedicated. Following the release of Overly Dedicated, Kendrick would begin work on his debut studio album, Section 80. However, in between the respective releases of OD and Section 80, Kendrick would record a few tracks with up-and-coming artist J. Cole. In 2010, J. Cole would name-drop Kendrick multiple times in interviews, before the two would say that they were working on top-secret shit together. In anticipation of his debut studio album, Kendrick would release the single High Power, in which J. Cole would have production credits on. And when asked about himself and J. Cole's work together in the studio, Kendrick would say, "It's a lot of music, it's not just one track," leading a lot of fans to believe a collab album was likely. In 2011, Kendrick would hold a meet and greet at Magic Disc Music Store in California. And it is at this meet and greet that he would play some new songs for the people in the room. Among these songs played, 2 of them would feature J. Cole, those tracks being Temptation and Shock the World. Following these songs being played, the two would continue to tease fans on the prospect of this album being a real thing. But soon, a trend would occur about these two teasing the album and then nothing coming of it. News regarding the project would go quiet, as the duo would both release respective solo projects, J. Cole releasing Cold World, and Kendrick dropping that debut studio album, Section 80. However, on the podcast, Cole would reassure fans that they just got back in the studio in early 2012, and they were working on stuff, collab albums still coming.
I just started working with Kendrick the other day. We got in finally again.
That mixtape that y'all,
Oh man,
it's like folklore. It's hip hop folklore.
Album, man.
The Kendrick J. Cole mixtape album.
Album tape.
So y'all are officially working on that.
Yeah, we working on it.
Okay, because
yeah,
I'm like, man, this is gonna be one of these projects.
Nah, I don't think it is. Cause you know why?
We never gonna come out.
We got back in. That was the first time we got back in a while. We actually got in the other night and actually worked, like bouncing ideas. You know what I'm saying? Which was great. And the vibe is so good that it's like, man, that's
How many
absolutely.
records did y'all do?
We got like maybe like four or five together. You know what I'm saying?
The very worst, an EP. Man.
Word, absolutely.
5 tracks.
Word.
Again, we go through kind of a dry period regarding news about the joint project, and Kendrick releases his second album, Good Kid, Mad City. And when going on a press run, taking interviews regarding the album and such, he is asked again, what's going on with the J. Cole project? So Kendrick just kind of reassured us that still happening, still coming out, but when it does release, you're not going to hear any hype for it. We're not going to give you a release date. It's just going to drop randomly with no promo. 2013 would come and we would still see no signs of this collab record coming out anytime soon. And J. Cole would kind of shed some light on why that was, how hard it was to release a joint project, work on a collab record when two artists who are trying to do this project together are signed to different labels. Cole would add that the collab may just end up being an EP, but either way, tracks were finished and in the vault, ready to be released. Since the time when the duo first teased the prospects of a collab album in 2010, both J. Cole and Kendrick Lamar had turned into musical stars, with albums released that fans considered instant classics. With J. Cole explaining the problems that occurred with the duo trying to finish this album, as well as just so much time passing, hype truly died down for this Kendrick Lamar J. Cole collab album. It's not because fans didn't want to hear it, far from it. It's simply because they believed it would never happen. The next time that this project would be mentioned would be 2 years later in 2015, as Kendrick would again go on record to say that there will be a collab record with himself and J. Cole, and that he had been in contact with Cole very recently. 2 months later, in November of 2015, Cole and Kendrick would randomly drop 2 songs, respectively, one each, on their Spotifys in an event they called Black Friday. Each track would be a remix of the other's song, using the beat and everything, but having their own verse on it. Cole would remix Alright, while Kendrick would rap over the beat of Tale of Two Cities. However, the most interesting part of this whole situation is the end of J. Cole's verse on his take on Alright, because he basically says, in a mocking kind of way, that him and Kendrick are going to be dropping in February of next year. Further adding to the theory that Cole and Kendrick would be dropping a collab in February of 2016 would be when Kendrick Lamar's sister would basically shout out Kendrick's track that he just dropped on Spotify and say, you know, I had vocals on this, check it out. By the way, collab dropping, where she literally says February 16th. However, February would come and go, and no collaboration would be released. While this project certainly existed and songs were created for it, even finished, I think it's safe to say that this thing isn't dropping anytime soon, if ever. Punch from TDE expressed this same sentiment a few years back on Twitter. And, honestly, like J. Cole said, he said it best a few years back in an interview in 2018 when they asked him, hey, is this collab album, what's going on? Is it ever going to happen? He kind of said, Kendrick's his own man, and so is he. When plans were created back in 2010 to make this joint project, both artists were so different than they are today. While a collab today would be fascinating and people would love to hear it, the project would just be so removed from what it originally was intended to be and sound like. However, on the opposite end of the coin, both are now so much more defined as artists, you can argue that the demand for a J. Cole Kendrick Lamar collab is hotter now, potentially, with both being so much more popular individually, but you gotta be real, that shit ain't happening. Following Good Kid, Mad City, Kendrick would begin to work on his third studio album that the world would eventually know as To Pimp a Butterfly. However, the first version that Kendrick would create for this record would end up being entirely scrapped. The original version was called To Pimp a Caterpillar, which, when abbreviated, spells Tupac. This album, just like the eventual final version, took heavy inspiration from Tupac and Kendrick's desire to not let the music industry pimp him out and be his own man despite his immense popularity. That theme, along with the contrast that also exists on the final version of the album about growing up in Compton to then finding fame and fortune, is seen in one of the main leaks from this era on a track titled Burn. The other leak we have access to from this early To Pimp a Butterfly era is a track called Crooked, which has this crazy beat and Kendrick flows over it really well. The verse would actually eventually be repurposed, but we obviously would never hear an official version on streaming of Crooked and Burn. They would never see the light of day because Kendrick's mindset regarding his up-and-coming album would all change following a trip to South Africa. In February of 2014, Kendrick would perform in South Africa, and his visit would move him so much that he decided to start fresh with his current album plans and take inspiration from the people he encountered and the culture he had experienced. The tracks created prior to the visit would be completely scrapped, and Kendrick would rename the album To Pimp A Butterfly. The name change, specifically caterpillar to butterfly, would come because Kendrick wanted to show the brightness of life. The butterfly is a man at his full potential, having beaten the odds and found peace and success. Additionally, the title holds more weight, with pimp being such an aggressive word, especially in contrast with a beautiful creature like the butterfly. Following the successful release of To Pimp a Butterfly, Kendrick Lamar would go on to drop an introspective, personal record 2 years later, with 2017's Damn. With the album being so personal, Kendrick would have trouble finding himself musically following the release. Similar to his mental state described on Damn, Kendrick would find himself in a rut and attempt various styles and concepts before finally settling on Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. As described by music leaker Atmos, from 2017 to 2019, Kendrick would create and scrap an abundance of projects, 3 of which we have information about. While the details of Kendrick's creative struggles in this time period are relatively scarce, the info we do have is fascinating. Kendrick has explored rock elements previously in his music. At the end of King Kunta, you got that crazy shredding guitar, but with Damn, you could feel a true shift creatively for Kendrick. You got the U2 collab, but like in general, it was a true step away from the sounds of Good Kid, Mad City and To Pimp a Butterfly. And allegedly, Kendrick's exploration of new sounds was just beginning, as in 2017, he reportedly recorded an entire rock album. Now, we know next to nothing about this album. A track list exists, but it's only owned by one person outside of Kendrick's camp. You may remember in 2020 when a Billboard worker by the name of Bill Word tweeted out that Kendrick's next album was going to be rock influenced. Well, this is likely what he was referencing, as the second-hand information he received was a tad bit late. Obviously, Kendrick's 5th album, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, as we know today, would not be rock influenced. And while plans changed and Kendrick took a different direction creatively, I for one would certainly love to hear what Kendrick Lamar, what he could do, in producing a rock album. I think it'd be really interesting. Another album worked on during Kendrick's creative route was allegedly a horror-style concept record about women. Allegedly, out of all the albums that were created in this time period between Damn and Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, this one was the closest to being finished. Kendrick discussed his daddy issues on Mr. Morale and how his father's harsh parenting style led him to having issues with relationships and women. Additionally, We Cry Together on Mr. Morale was very theatrical, and this concept album had a film created for it that was fully shot, edited, and complete. Kendrick is a fantastic storyteller, so I'm really fascinated by this project and what it would have been. Ultimately, the information on it is really vague, but I'd imagine the same sentiments echoed on Mr. Morale about his relationships with women, issues in his personal life, and daddy issues would have kind of mirrored the concept that would have been this album. While Kendrick was spurring through ideas for his next album, he would finally land on the concept of Mr. Morale in 2018, following the completion of the Black Panther soundtrack. The album from the start was set to be very personal, but Kendrick was having trouble translating his thoughts and feelings into music in a way that was quality and on par for him creatively. Now, a lot of the tracks that were created for Mr. Morale in this early version would actually be given to Baby Keem for his early mixtapes. Baby Keem, for those who don't know, is the cousin of Kendrick Lamar. He's really been a breath of fresh air in the music industry since dropping his debut album, The Melodic Blue, and first began working with Kendrick during the Damn sessions. While trying to find his groove here, he would work a lot with Keem, not only giving him tracks, but also working with him on songs such as Vent, which originally had a Kendrick verse on it. In 2019, Kendrick would allegedly, while working on Mr. Morale, simultaneously start working with Baby Keem on a collab record in London, centered around the idea of venting out frustrations when working on his 5th studio album. Now, the songs that were created for this collab album, relatively unknown, at least at this point in time, but Kendrick and Keem would have a lot of collaborations on Keem's album, The Melodic Blue. It's not a crazy assumption to say that Keem played a big role in helping Kendrick find his spark again musically, with songs like Family Ties and Range Brothers allowing Kendrick to simply have fun and take risks with his voice and flows. It is believed that this period working with Keem is what would spark Kendrick to fully understand his intentions and plans when working on the version of Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers that we would eventually hear on streaming. From there, Kendrick would continue work on his upcoming album, with tracks like Hooligan and Prayer being created in this first era in 2019 and in 2020. Over the next couple of years, Kendrick would transform tracks, trash them, and eventually scrap the original version of Mr. Morale before finally releasing that double album in May of 2022. One thing I think people don't talk about enough is how well done the introduction of Baby Keem to the music world was. Family Ties would drop following Keem going on a feature run with big artists like Kanye West, and also dropping 2 solid mixtapes that allowed him to kind of find his sound and his identity musically. Then The Melodic Blue drops, he has some other tracks with Kendrick, and he's even featured on Kendrick's album Mr. Morale in 2022, and from there, people are like, holy shit, these 2 guys are actually really talented on their own, we want a collab album. Well, it would have been interesting to hear one from the duo back then. With Keem being more defined as his own artist, I think now is the better time for that joint record to drop. Recently, Kendrick and Keem dropped the track Hillbillies, leading some to believe that that collab album is coming soon. And honestly, out of all the albums discussed in this video regarding Kendrick Lamar's unreleased discography, I think a collab with Baby Keem is the most likely to actually see the light of day. And it's a matter of when rather than if.